Hi, my name is National Master Eric Montany, and I'd like to welcome you to the first video in a series I'd like to call Chess in the Pits. Because, I always thought of these weekend amateur tournaments where people are maybe traveling, maybe getting a hotel room sometimes, and then just like throwing their pieces at each other, just trying to kill each other. I always thought of them as kind of like gladiators going to battle in the gladiatorial pit. So this series of videos is not going to be devoted to Grandmaster games. Right? It's going to be devoted to players in a range of about, let's say, like 1800 to maybe IM strength. Some decently strong club players and some strong, very strong amateur players as well. And I think there's some interesting chess being played at this level, and there's a lot to learn. Right? There's a lot of players out there stuck at 1200, 1600, 1800, trying to become 2000, trying to become a master. And the games I'm going to show you, I think, are going to give you a good idea of chess at this level, like real chess that's actually being played out there in tournaments. And you'll see mistakes like the kind of mistakes that you're making, perhaps, and you can avoid those. And see some mistakes that are similar to the ones that your opponents are making, and you can learn how to punish those. So I kind of chose at random to start with this game of mine against Bruce Baker. I just opened up an old file of mine and saw this game again, thought it was interesting. Unfortunately, I just looked it up, and I believe Bruce Baker has passed away. But he was a strong player in San Diego at the time I was living there, and I believe he'd been above 2400 for quite some time. When I lived in San Diego, he was rated right around like 2300 to 2350, also still quite a good player. And this game in 2009, when I played against him, I was rated about 2100 or so. So anyway, let's just take a quick look. It was a e4, c5, a Sicilian. One thing I just say about the Sicilian very quickly is that when you play c5 as black, you do not help the development of any of your minor pieces. Maybe you'd argue like the knight on c6, right? But you're not getting diagonal open for either of your bishops. So it makes sense, a lot of sense, for white to go into the open Sicilian like this, where white just rips the center open as quickly as possible. White can develop both of his bishops, bishop to e2, bishop to c4, bishop could come to e3 or g5. And black has to be very careful. When you play the Sicilian, I often find that like when you lose really badly. You lose in 25 moves, 20 moves sometimes. The center becomes open. You just get destroyed, right? And the variation I chose, the Taimanov variation, is kind of even more risky in the sense that you do delay your kingside development for quite some time. So if you are new to the Sicilian, I maybe wouldn't recommend this. I might recommend in this position playing like knight f6, knight c3, and then d6, so that you can cover the e5 square and develop the bishop to e7. Really, if you're brand new to the Sicilian and you want to start it, I would recommend playing d6 on move 2 here. And then after something like, pawn takes, knight knight f6, knight c3, you've played d6 so that you could develop your knight to f6 as rapidly as possible. You've stopped the e4, e5 push. And now I think it makes a lot of sense, noticing that the bishop is, this diagonal is blocked in by 2 pawns to play the dragon. And there's a lot of theory here, which you could learn, or play it without a ton of theory, depending on your level. But, you'll play bishop g7, you'll get your king castled, your knight will come to c6, your bishop can go to d7, sometimes you'll play a6 and b5 and bishop b7. So this is how I learned to play the Sicilian first. I'll probably throw in some dragon games in the future here in this series, but to me it's a much more logical way of playing the Sicilian. Whereas the Taimanov, as I played, or the Taimanov, after knight c6, knight c3, you really do run the risk of falling behind in development and getting blown off the board. Now in this position, I played the move a6, which is probably not the most popular. The most common move, I think, in this position is queen c7, although I believe the two moves are approximately equally good. The main reason I didn't want to play queen c7, there were really two reasons. was because at the time there was this line that had been played for about maybe 10 years or so around this time that goes knight b5, queen b8, bishop e3. And then after a6, instead of retreating the knight to like d4, when black would be completely fine after knight f6. In fact, funnily enough, in this position, black could just play queen c7 and just transpose back into a regular Taimanov, but knight f6 must be stronger than that. Instead of playing like this, instead of retreating, white's idea is to play bishop b6. And if knight c7 check happens, black is in a lot of trouble. So you have to take, and the only real way to defend is to play bishop b4 check and give up the queen, like this. And theory considers this fine for black, but at the time, I was kind of uncomfortable in this position. Black does have some practical, problems to deal with. The pawn on g7, do you play g6, which is maybe weakening? And it's hard to find like outposts for the knight and really great squares right away for the minor pieces. Funnily enough, missing the pawn on a6 is kind of a big deal because you can't really play a6 and b5 and bishop b7. So I found it hard to get the c8 bishop like an active role in the game. So anyway, that's why I didn't play queen c7. That's one of the reasons I played a6 instead. So after a6, the other reason is that if white played the English attack, which was quite common back then and still is, with bishop e3, I like to play the system knight f6, queen d2, bishop b4, f3, and then d5. And if white castles queenside, then I'll play queen a5 and not bother with queen c7. So the queen's a little more active on a5 here. I think the position's perfectly playable for either side, for both sides. But I do think that this is a little bit easier for black to handle than the regular English attack lines. So anyhow, these are the kinds of decisions that you have to make in your own games and like with your own opening repertoire. Like what positions are you aiming for? Which ones do you want to avoid? In the game, Bruce decided to avoid some of the more like mainline Taimanov variations, and he played knight takes c6, which is potentially the strongest move in this position. It's certainly the strongest move to try to punish black's move order, to try to the move order with a6 instead of queen c7. The point is that after bishop d3 and d5, we reach a pawn structure here where the move a7 to a6 is just a complete waste of time. Completely a waste of time. And I think this is really obvious if you were to go back. And let's say in this position, right? Knight c6 would not be so good now because, you're helping to bring the b pawn closer to the center. Black has more central control. But after something like knight c3, bishop b3, bishop, something like this, if black plays, knight f6, castle, bishop b7, right? In none of these positions would we ever play a6. Instead, what we might play, especially if white plays like e5, knight d7, maybe rook e1 here, a5 is a very strong move, with the idea of trading off this bad light square bishop. I should say a very strong idea. It may not be the best move in this position. You might want to castle first, or maybe even play queen c7 to hit the pawn. But yeah, you would never put the pawn on a6, right? So going back to my game against Bruce Baker, in this position after black has played a6, this is a very tempting way of trying to punish black, because now you're getting the same position we just kind of looked at briefly, but essentially white has a whole extra tempo because black has played this waste of a move a6, and if you do want to play the a5 bishop a6 idea, it's going to take you an entire extra move to do it. So I played d5, castle, knight f6. Bruce plays queen e2. I should say that the main idea here, and queen e2 is one of the main moves, moves. But the main idea is for white to play e4, e5, right? So we can just play this now to get it on the board. But e4, e5, knight d7. White wants to, attack black's king. Moves like maybe queen g4 after the bishop on f8 moves, possibly f4 and f5. So this is what white's aiming for. He's trying to find the proper moment to push through like that. And black has to come up with a plan to counter white's attack. So the game went queen e2. I played bishop e7. Another thing I'd like to point out is if like e5 here, knight d7, in addition to moving, pawn to a5 and then bishop to a6, black has an interesting idea of just putting the knight on c5, right, and then capturing this bishop on d3. So after queen e2, where the bishop can't retreat back to e2, sometimes white needs to kind of worry about how to deal with this knight c5 idea. So these are kind of the two ways of for black to try to go after that very powerful light square bishop. In the game, Bruce played bishop d2, which is a very, very good, very normal developing move, connecting the rooks, etc. So I castled, and Bruce played rook a to e1. I should point out this was like a rapid game, right? This, I would say, maybe a game in 45 with 5-second delay, or it might have been game in 45, and so back then what you did was you took 5 minutes off the clock for both sides, and it was game in 40 with 5-second delay. So a lot of the moves, a lot of the decisions we're making are kind of practical and based a little bit on the rapid time control. So, white clearly has a lead in development. He's going to play e4, e5. He's going to start attacking. And, this is the first moment that I had a pretty serious think. I decided to come up with the move pawn to g6. Because, I want to be in a position where after e5, I don't have to worry about responding to like a bishop takes pawn check or queen h5 type of idea. I want to be in a position where if he plays, say, e5 now, knight d7, then I'm immediately ready to play like knight c5, or even to hit back perhaps with f6 or f5 to try to close the position up. One thing that you would, white would never want to happen is, let's say, if e5, knight d7, f4, right? Something like this, knight c5 would be quite good for black, because I'm going to take white's best minor piece here. And then, once that trade happens, right, it's going to be hard for him to push through and get this bishop active into the game. So this is one of the reasons I played g6. White decided to play king h1, kind of just waiting a little bit longer. I played rook b8, and, just hitting that pawn on b2, and he played b3. And so this is the point of the game where it starts to get interesting. Like, I had to come up with something, because he does eventually have moves like, now that he's played king h1, right, he could play e5, f4, even g4 to push through that f5 pawn push. Bishop h6 might come, get out some of the dark squares. So I played a very interesting combative idea here that probably is not best, but it poses problems for white. And that's what chess is all about, right? Is playing interesting ideas that pose your opponent problems and trying to solve the problems that your opponent sets you. I played rook to b4. And you'll see the idea in a moment. After white plays e5, knight d7, knight a4, I played rook h4. So instead of having this rook, right, stuck way back here on b8, where it does absolutely nothing on the b file, I've got it kind of staring at his king right here, kind of off on its own, which is a little bit crazy. but I'm anticipating getting rid of the e5 pawn. I'm anticipating playing like, you know, queen c7, or even f6, and making this, you know, pawn exchange here happen, and then getting on that diagonal and hitting h2. I also cover the h6 square, right? So bishop h6 is no longer ever really a problem. I would say, you know, during the game, I was a little bit curious what would happen if white just played f3. I'm not saying it's the best move, but then it really does kind of question, like, why is my rook sitting on b4 here? So that might have been an interesting idea for him. I might have had to go back and play something like, you know, a5. I'm debating whether white should try to play something like a3 here, but probably not, because the a3 pawn is going to be weak. Anyhow, the game continued e5, knight d7, at knight a4 and rook h4. Knight a4 is a good move in the sense that it might prepare pawn to c4, and it covers the c5 square, so that if black ever tries to play knight c5 to take that bishop on d3, white will just take it. Now in this position, my opponent surprised me, because he played bishop takes a6, and this is a mistake. Unfortunately, in the game, I had forgotten that it was a mistake. And this has happened to me before. I can think of a few occasions where, so in this position here, this is when I began my idea, right? I thought, okay, rook b8, b3, rook b4, he pushes the pawn, I move, rook h4. I had seen the refutation of bishop takes a6, or at least seen the strongest continuation. And so I dismissed it from my mind. And I started thinking about other things. But when the position arrived on the board, I'd forgotten that I had already dismissed this move, and I kind of, I wouldn't say panicked, but, you know, I felt that surge of, like, kind of fear or adrenaline. I wasn't quite sure what was happening. Like, oh crap, I overlooked this. And I ended up playing not the best move. Of course, the best move here, which I had seen and forgotten about, is rook e4. Because, you know, the queen can't move anywhere, right? If the queen goes to d3, then we have knight c5. We're winning the bishop. So the queen can't move anywhere. The bishop has to block on e3, and now we can just take the pawn on e5. And now, you know, black just has a nice position. You know, bishop takes c8, queen takes c8, kind of thing, maybe f4. You know, in this position, I probably would play rook h5 here, but even rook e4 would be possible. So this would be a nice position for black. Anyhow, unfortunately, I overlooked rook e4. So my opponent played bishop a6, surprising me. And I forgot that I had this strong move. And I played a suboptimal move, but it was one that really initiated a lot of complications. I played knight takes e5. Of course, white can't just take on e5, because I'll take the bishop on a6, and that'd be quite good for me. So the position starts to get messy here, and this is pretty common, I think, of most games below Grandmaster level, even between pretty strong players. Right? The position gets messy, it's hard to calculate everything, and you're driven, like your decision-making has to come from your positional judgment, your calculation abilities, kind of your gut feeling, and you sort of get swept up with this sort of surge of dynamism, and you have to kind of ride that wave for a while. And I think I did a pretty good job of that in this game. So I was quite pleased with it. White plays bishop takes c8. Now he is threatening the knight on e5. So I played knight to g4. And unfortunately, my opponent found the strongest move in this position. So the only move that I had really looked at when I played knight takes e5 was h3. And then after, you know, queen takes c8, I think this is approximately equal. I might prefer black here. Another strong way for white to play is actually bishop to e6. when I was going to play queen to d6, finding mate. And if like g3, you know, take, check. I can take here. So bishop on d2 is being hit, so, you know, bishop d1, and now rook f7 is the only move to save the bishop on e7 and the rook on f2. And this is actually quite playable for black. I was worried about this line in the game because black's down a pawn, but you know, looking at it now, I think it would be quite playable for black. It's certainly unclear. That pawn on a2 has a long ways to go before queening, and black is pretty active. Anyhow, there's a lot to see, and I certainly didn't see all of these lines, right? So in this position, after my opponent takes on c8, right, I played knight takes e5, bishop takes c8, I played knight g4. My opponent found the move that I hadn't really noticed at all, because I thought his pawn on h2 is hanging, right? Rook takes h2 or knight takes h2 looks very strong coming up here. But he played a very good move, showing why he's a strong player. He played g3. And it started to dawn on me here that I was in some pretty big trouble. And I'm going to lose a piece, right? I'm going to have to play the game one piece down. The only question is really like how to give up the piece, how to best give up the piece to create chances. So you might want to pause the video and have a little think for yourself and kind of figure out how you would go about doing this. But I decided to play rook takes h2 check. And after king g1, I should point out the reason we're losing a piece, right, is because the knight on g4 is hanging and our rook h2 will hang after we move the knight or after the knight is captured. So in this position, I played rook takes f2. I figured if I'm losing a piece anyways, then I might as well get as many of those kingside pawns for it as I possibly can. So rook takes, knight takes, and up until here, white is played basically perfectly. And in fact, the computer says if he takes with the king, or the queen, but the computer seems to prefer taking with the king for some reason. If he just takes, the computer says that white is like much better, almost winning. But I don't know, it looks a little bit messy to me. But I mean, certainly I can agree with the computer. I'm not going to argue with that. He's up a piece. Probably should be much better here. Luckily for me, my opponent made a mistake. I think it was based on a miscalculation. My opponent played bishop takes e6. So I think, you know, I've made a mistake or two, and now my opponent's kind of repaying that favor, and the game is very unclear again. Bishop takes e6. What's white's idea? Because if we're not careful, we will lose this position. We'll lose this game. It took me a little while, but I realized that if f takes e6, queen takes e6 check, he's hitting the bishop on e7, rook f7, everything looks pretty good for me. Until you notice rook f1. And now black is just completely dead. Because, I mean, I guess the best move, I don't even know what to suggest. I mean, you're losing the knight on f2 because you can't move the knight because of the rook on f7 hanging, but you're losing the rook on f7 after that also, right? So you're totally dead here. I suppose the best move might be like queen d6, but he can just trade queens and then take here, and yeah, you're just down a piece with absolutely no compensation now. So anyhow, this is white's idea after bishop takes e6. But black has a very strong move here. I played knight to e4. And around here I started to think that I really did have full compensation for the piece. Because if he saves his bishop, which of course he has to do, you know, his pawn on g3 could fall. And once that pawn on g3 falls and his king is completely, you know, exposed, I'm going to have very, very real counter chances. So, Bruce played bishop h3. Of course, I can't take on g3 yet because the bishop on e7 falls, so bishop d6. And here Bruce played bishop to h6. And I made maybe, perhaps, a slight inaccuracy, although it's hard to call it an inaccuracy. I played rook e8. Incredibly, after looking at this with the computer says that after bishop takes g3, bishop takes f8, queen takes f8, the computer says this is completely equal. You know, white's down, or black is down a rook for, what, 2 pawns? But black's king is very safe. White's king is exposed. To be honest, I don't really understand why this is equal, but if you let the computer run forever, it says 0.00, so, okay, can't argue with that anymore these days. But, yeah, apparently this was the best way for black to play. Of course, I didn't see that. I just played rook e8, thinking that I had very good, you know, very good compensation for a piece here. I'm going to win the pawn on g3. His king is going to be wide open. Sure, I'm down a piece, but I'll have plenty of practical chances. In this position, my opponent played, I guess, perhaps, maybe not quite the losing move, but yeah, he made another mistake here, which allowed me to seize the initiative and perhaps win the game. He played bishop to f4. And, well, I suspect that he made a miscalculation here again, because I can take, and then almost any move, well, any move by black, except the one I played, would leave white in complete control. I played queen h4, and this has a really nice dual move. It threatens the bishop on h3, but it also threatens a retreating move, which I saw. And it's really hard when you're like, when you think you have the advantage and you feel like you're attacking, you're trying to refute your opponent's play, which I think is what White was doing in this game. It's really hard to see these retreating yet attacking moves. Right? I'm attacking the bishop on h3, but I'm also attacking the rook on h1. So after bishop to f1, I could play knight f6. And he can't move the queen or the rook falls. I have a feeling that maybe Bruce had planned to play queen f2 here, but after take, knight c4 check, I win the rook. And White doesn't even get the knight on g4, right? Because I take here, and if he takes this, I take the bishop on f1. So he's just totally lost here. I'm going to go win the queenside pawns now. So, all right, so in this position, knight f6, and black is basically winning. Take, rook takes, king g7. You know, materially speaking, right, it's what, approximately equal? Maybe White's even doing better here, right? Rook, bishop, knight for queen and pawn. But White's king is just totally exposed, so there's really nothing that White can do. He played rook e2, queen takes f4, rook f2, queen d4. I don't think that I played, you know, the very best moves from here on out, but good enough to win. G5, you know, getting my huge kingside pawn majority rolling. 3 against 0, that's a pretty big pawn majority, right? G4, taking some squares away from the king, threatening, well, maybe queen h3 check in some lines, gives my queen access to some squares. Bishop d3, h5, bishop f5, king h6, king g5, he took f5. check, f4, bishop d2, I have queen d3. Unfortunately here, I stopped keeping score, so I did win this game, but I was down to about 3 minutes left. I have a note in this game score that says that. So, you know, when you get down below 5 minutes in a sudden death time control, you can stop keeping score. So I don't have the rest of the game score, but if you let the computer run here, it says it's like, you know, -10. So black is completely winning, right? You're going to have to give up probably your rook and a minor piece or two just to stop these pawns from promoting. So I think that was a very interesting game. If we go back to the beginning, kind of look at it a little bit more slowly, or excuse me, a little bit more quickly, right? Knight f3, e6. I think it's very typical in some ways, just about how chess is played, right? It's a game of ideas. It's a battle of two different ideas. Knight takes, pawn takes. And in this particular game, black's ideas triumphed. You know, I was pretty proud. I came up with this interesting plan of putting my rook on b8. I don't know that I would repeat this plan in this exact position here, but, you know, the playing rook to b4. But it certainly turned out well in this game, and white didn't find a way to really refute it. He came close, but just one or two little slips, and he was losing. Rook h4. Yeah, and then bishop takes a6. Of course, rook e4 was stronger here, but, you know, after this, the complications really start. And this is where the kind of chess games are won or lost, right? Kind of seeing your way through all these complications and choosing the most practical way forward when you can't calculate everything completely. I do like this move g3 very much of Bruce's. I had completely missed that. And I think here was another big turning point of the game, like another critical moment. How does black give up the piece in the best possible way to get the most possible counterplay? And I think I did a pretty good job with that here. And now once white made a mistake here with bishop takes e6, you know, the game is wide open again after knight e4. So, you know, interesting game. Shows a lot about the importance of king safety, right? Really the most important aspect in chess, I suppose, right? Because checkmate ends the game. When the king is weak, you have a very, very difficult time coordinating your pieces and doing much of anything. Anyways, hopefully this was enjoyable. Hopefully you learned a little something, and hope to see you next time.